Good morning, everyone. It sounds like the sound is working, right? Okay, great. Thank you so much for coming today. I first wanted to start by saying how excited I am about this series. It's been on the back of my mind for a couple years to offer it. And it's really just been a matter of getting a set of weeks in a row that worked for the congregation's calendar and especially for my own. But we found 4. I'm really excited about that. Some of you may know I teach an Introduction to World Religions class at the university, which I enjoy a lot. But there are lots of things I can't do in that class that I can do here. First of all, I don't have to, there's no papers or tests or anything, so that is a wonderful freedom. And I can also speak more personally about some of my experiences with these traditions and perspectives on them. Today's class is just going to be kind of an overview, a little bit about the history of studying and talking about religion to prepare us for the other weeks in the series, which will each focus on a different religious tradition. So next week would be Hinduism, the week after that Buddhism, and the week after that Sikhism or Sikhism. I hear Sikhism more often than I hear Sikhism, so that's probably what I'll say, but you hear both. And then we'll find a couple other, probably 3-week series a little bit later in the church calendar, where we can do other traditions like Judaism, Islam, probably Navajo religion, Confucianism, Taoism, maybe atheism. There's more religious traditions than that, but those are the ones that I usually teach. I might mention some others along the way, including today. So this is the orientation session, and then the others will all focus on single religious traditions. All right. So I have a couple goals for this series, which I'm sure I'll come back to several times, remind us of as we go along. But the first one is just to examine some key teachings or stories or rituals or practices that are connected with particular religious traditions. So it won't be comprehensive, right, or the whole history of the religious tradition, all the range of its diversity, but I just want to pick out a couple things that I find particularly distinctive or interesting, inspiring, or challenging. And that gets to our second goal, which is to consider how each tradition might challenge or enlighten Episcopalian Christians who are seeking to love God and our neighbor. So I think all of these religious traditions are something that contains something that I've learned a lot from about the love of God, even the ones that aren't theistic, that is, that aren't centered around a God. But I also think of learning about other religious traditions as in itself an act of love for our neighbors with whom we share this world. So I'm going to take some time to walk us through brief history of how approaches to the religious diversity of the world have changed over time. So I'll talk about a couple of these are kind of loose, I say older ways, and then a newer way, which is popular now, and then because we're Episcopalian, this is the part I don't do in class. I'm obviously, no surprises here, going to take a middle way, right? This is part of our ethos as Anglican Episcopalian Christians. All right. So one of these older ways is to try, and this is more coming from 19th century anthropology. So here the tendency would be to look at the religious diversity of the world and try to posit some sort of evolutionary or developmental trajectory of religious traditions. So they would categorize religions along this spectrum from what they considered primitive to what they considered developed or advanced. So you can organize religious traditions of the world according to some kind of developmental or evolutionary model, where some seem simplistic, superstitious, and others seem sophisticated and particularly insightful. All right, so the classic would be the move from polytheism to monotheism, that in these models, people would see polytheism as an underdeveloped form of religion and monotheism as the developed, sophisticated form. All right. So developed religions are usually monotheistic and text-based, right? They don't see God in, sticks and stones like the primitive folks would, okay? Again, according to this model. So I'm going to show you an illustration of, partly to show that these so-called older ways are still very much alive and with us. I'm going to show you an illustration that made the rounds on social media for some time by a guy named Simon E. Davies, so I don't really know about or anything, but he created a pretty complex evolution, what he calls an evolutionary tree of religion that shows the progress of human thought from animism. Now, animism, people say, it's more of a construct of anthropologists, but it would refer to belief that inanimate objects, sticks, stones, like I said, plants, springs of water, contain spirits, were animate, all right? And human beings progressed from the type of religious belief, again, according to this model, all the way through religion and then to science, right? Because that's the best way of knowing, all right? So the detail is too small for you to see. I just want you to see this image of how complex it is and its theories of how different ways of thinking and ways of knowing are connected to each other. So I have to say that scholars of religion do not like this, this graphic, but you might see it out there, because of some of its assumptions, and I'll tell you one of them. So critiques of this older way, this evolutionary developmental model of religious traditions, are first of all that developed religions look an awful lot like Protestant Christianity, right? So it seems like, again, we all carry with us our biases, and later generations have tried to identify these. You came along and said, well, I know that my religious tradition is superior, right? We revere texts, not objects, right? We believe in one God, not many gods. And so if you assume yourself at the top, right, everything else is going to look inferior or something. So, and sometimes they evaluate religious traditions like Buddhism or Hinduism in their sort of what they considered the pure form, which also looks an awful lot like Protestant Christianity. Another problem with this is animism was really a concept invented by anthropologists to try to lump together a range of Aboriginal or Indigenous religious practices, right? So you go to Australia or Native American communities in the United States, and they tried to theorize that these folks were primitive and whatever religious practices they had resembled each other. Okay, so later scholars have come along and said this is not true. All religions develop over time, all right? So you can't walk around the world and say those people have advanced religion and those people have primitive religion. Really, everyone's religious traditions are developed in their own way. They all develop over time. So I want to give example. This is the one time probably that I'll talk about an African indigenous religious practice. There's lots of different communities in Africa, so this isn't necessarily representative. But there's a practice called Kola nut divination, and there are actually many forms of divination. Now, we're familiar with divination from the expression of reading the tea leaves, right? You brew some tea, you drink your tea, and you look into it, and if it was loose leaf tea, that we assume that, the tea leaves will be in a particular pattern, right? And you can kind of fortune tell on the basis of that pattern. Well, there is this practice in several African communities of divination by other means, and one of them is Kola nut divination. So the image, yes, on our right, shows the different fragments of this nut, and you can dry them out and cast them into see that circular plate, kind of like a ceremonial plate. You can cast the kola nuts onto that, and based on how they land, how many of them are touching, I don't know the rules of this. You can get trained in all this kind of stuff. You can discern an answer to your question or a course of action that you should take. So it's easy for me as an outsider to these customs to say, well, in that religion, you just like roll the dice, right? That's it. It's just a luck kind of issue. Of course, I have to say, there are many points in Scripture where people do cast lots, right? It's just that Episcopalian Christians in particular haven't developed those forms of discerning the will or the calling of God. We've developed other ways, all right? So I once I knew about this practice, but it wasn't until I watched a video, and I think it was footage, again, I think by some anthropologists, probably 4 decades old or so, maybe 5, I don't know. And it was of some men in a village trying to decide whether they should make a journey to another village. And they practiced this type of divination. But when I watched the video, I saw that they were all sitting around and they were casting the nuts many times, right? It's not just like rolling dice. Like if it's an odd number, we go. If it's an even number, we don't. It was not that simple. So there were many, many casts. And the guy divining, really had to, I don't know what was going on, but it was more of, counting how many are touching, what shape they're in. It wasn't easy, right? And also, all around him, there was a conversation taking place. Again, this is all subtitled, because I don't know the language, but assuming the subtitles are right, they were also talking about whether they should go or not. Right? They weren't just throwing it into the hands of a roll of dice. They were having a discerning conversation about it as well. So I came to think that this wasn't perhaps all that different from what's pictured on the right here is what's called a Quaker Clearness Committee. And my church growing up actually had one of these. So it's a group of people who are trained in this practice of discerning call. And you could go to them with a question, like, should I take this job? Should I not take this job? And they are trained to sit in silence and ask you questions that will kind of open you up. So basically, I was able to see both the Clearness Committee and this practice of Kola nut divination as sophisticated tools for discerning, now I don't know if they would use this language, but the will of God, or discerning what should happen next and how to respond, right, to questions and callings. So I give that as an example of, instead of categorizing some religions as primitive and others as developed, recognizing that all religious traditions are sophisticated and developed. So now I'll go to older way 2, right? So older way 1 was the sort of developmental evolutionary categorization of religion. Way 2 is emphasizing the sameness of the world's religious tradition. So in 1958, this book on the left was published as The Religions of Man. And a lot of people I talk to who say, oh, I took Intro to World Religions or Religions of the World I have people say this all the time, as an undergraduate, and it was the best class I ever took, right? A lot of them used The Religions of Man as their textbook. Now, because today we don't use, or we're discouraged from using man to refer to all human beings, it has an updated title, right? Because we already know that sounds very passé, right? So the updated version is The World's Religions. I think the book has been revised in other ways as well, but it's a pretty dominant way of approaching the world's religions. The emphasis tends to be religions in their best and their true forms, right? So kind of a famous example of Buddhist violence, let's say, has taken place in Myanmar. But someone might come along and say, that's not real Buddhism, right? That's the abuse of Buddhism or something. We could do the same with Christianity and say, the Crusades, that's not real Christianity, right? That is, just a debased form of Christianity, or people using their Christianity as an excuse to be violent, which is what they want to do anyway, okay? So this tendency was to separate the best type of religion and just kind of ignore the negative consequences of religion as not being kind of real religion. The assumption here, or the emphasis at least, is that religions are different in belief and practice, but they're the same in essence, okay? So I would say this view is very much alive and well. I actually remember when I was a graduate student, I was at a Starbucks and I was studying there, so I had books from what I was studying, and the barista said, oh, what are you studying? I said, religion, and she said, all religions are just the same, and I said, okay, I know, but that's, in graduate school, we're trained out of that now. But it's very common for people to have this view. So I have a quote from The Religions of Man that really illustrates this. And you hear this metaphor a lot. Different roads up the same mountain, right? So here's the quote. It is possible to climb life's mountain from any side, but when the top is reached, the trails converge. At base, the foothills of theology, ritual, and organizational structure, the religions are distinct. But beyond these differences, the same goal beckons, right? So I'd say this is a pretty common way of viewing the world's religions, that we got the foothills, right? Different beliefs, different practices, different organizations. But if you can kind of get away from all that and ascend beyond your tradition, you'll discover that really everyone's striving toward the same goal. So I just pulled some illustrations, right, of this. This is like bumper sticker type of stuff. Actually, the next one really is, well, I guess it's a decal, okay? Many paths, one journey, surrounded by all these symbols of different religious traditions. And then I found this sticker. It's no longer available, but I guess you could get it somewhere else, right? Live in peace and love, right? So here, I think the mountaintop, right, is peace and love, right? And then the foothills are, you see the Om symbol, the cross, crescent, and star and crescent, menorah, And I think that's between the yin-yang and the menorah, that atomic symbol, it looks like a symbol of atomic energy. I think that's science, So they've put that in there. So anyway, the idea here is there's diverse religious traditions, but really one goal. So the critiques of the second of the older ways are, first of all, no one can agree, right, on what it's very well for us all to say, oh, we're all striving toward the same common goal. Or all religions share the same essence. But when you really ask, well, what is that essence? What is that goal? We're not always on the same page. Some people say, well, it's union with the divine, right? A mystical encounter with God. So there's books that take that approach. Others say it's ethical behavior, right? Everyone is teaching that you shouldn't lie, cheat, or steal, But it's hard to figure out what the common essence is. But this approach also neglects fundamental differences as well as religious conflict, right? Again, that emphasis is on the good part, and it can't really explain why people fight over their religious differences or how religious differences exacerbate or fuel or legitimize other types of conflict in the world. So because of these critiques, we have a newer way, and that I've chosen to represent this way by Stephen Prothero. I do that because he's a religion professor, but he's the kind of guy like you might see on television. He goes on, I guess these shows aren't on the air, but the Colbert Report, the Daily Show with Jon Stewart, but he's on the news, he gets around, does a lot of public speaking, so he's kind of famous, talking about religious literacy. And he has this book, God is Not One, okay? Like nice, provocative title. And I have some friends who teach using this book. They teach their Intro to World Religions class using it. And let me see if I can make out the full subtitle. So God is Not One, the 8 rival religions that run the world and why their differences matter, okay? So you can already get a different vibe, right? The emphasis, they run the world, right? Their impact on the world is important, and they're rivals, right? They're not like allies in building a better world, okay? So I say that if you ever watch a clip of him on one of those shows, he's quite the dynamic speaker and performer, so you can tell why I don't know how much of this is his publisher and how much is himself, but this is a book that's, going after the kind of harmony approach to world religions. So God is Not One came out in 2010. He tries to examine together both the good and the bad aspects of religious traditions and religious adherence, right? Again, not to ignore the Crusades when you talk about Christianity or Islam. it also acknowledges fundamental differences between traditions, all right, instead of trying to ignore them. I have to credit some of my students with this insight because a couple of them, actually, in papers that they did last semester, made an analogy between approaches to racial difference and approaches to religious difference that many of us, myself included, are kind of encouraged to, racial difference is something you're supposed to ignore, right? You're supposed to not see it. You're supposed to gloss over, like, we're all just human. And my students said, and now there's, desire to acknowledge fundamental differences between people, right? And which include culture and that kind of thing, and to not try to ignore those things. And in religious studies, we've gone through a similar movement, right, to say our job is not to ignore and overlook differences. Our job is to acknowledge differences and to, in some cases, just to sit with them, right, without denying that they exist. So Prothero, in particular, has a model to kind of, in a simple way, distinguish a lot of these religious traditions. And he argues that they're different. Their differences come from the fact that they define the problem of humanity, creation, whatever it is, the world. They define the problem in specific ways. And therefore, the traditions result in solutions that are also different. So this is very simplified, but I just want you to at least get a feel for the profound differences that some others have made of these traditions. So just to start with a tradition most of us are most familiar with, in Christianity, the problem is sin, and the solution is salvation. In Judaism, the problem is exile, and the solution would be return to God or return to sacred land. In Islam, the problem is pride, and the solution is submission. In Hinduism, the problem is samsara. We're going to go back to all these. This is the overview day. The problem is samsara, right? That's a word for the cycle of rebirth and redeath. And the solution is moksha, that is release from this cycle. So you can already see, right? A lot of these traditions don't have a teaching on sin the way that many forms of Christianity do. Buddhism, the problem is suffering, and the solution is nirvana, which means the extinction of suffering, really kind of the cutting off the fuel of suffering. Confucianism, problem is social chaos, solution is social harmony. Taoism, the problem is lifelessness, the solution is vitality. Now, of course, in my mind, I can go back through all of these things and think, as a Christian, all of those problems are actually part of Christian tradition, right? That lifelessness is a problem, social chaos is a problem. So I could go through and say there's a Christian solution or efforts, at least, to deal with suffering, et cetera. Maybe not the cycle of birth and rebirth and redeath, but anyway, I think I don't want to oversimplify, right, to say that Christianity is only concerned with sin. We also deal with exile and all kinds of things. But I just do this to give you a sense of where Prothero's coming from and this newer approach, which is to say, let's look at and sit with traditions and their differences. So again, in this newer way, the emphasis is on how religious traditions differ from each other and the impact of those differences in the world. All right, so now the middle way. This is what I do, right, with my Episcopalian temperament, right, is I'm going to find a way between these two. And that's what it will be kind of behind my approach in this series. First of all, I am going to emphasize what's different and distinctive, partly because that's the most exciting. Like, I don't want to come here, right, and say, we do this, and look, those other people do exactly the same thing, right? It's kind of boring, right? So I'm going to, try to focus on some things that are really interesting and exciting and curious so that we can acknowledge some of these differences instead of trying to wash over and say, like, oh, we're all just trying to love each other, I'm also going to make connections, though, to Episcopal Christianity, right? So me, as an Episcopalian, what do I find that's of value within these different distinctive traditions? And a lot of the time, it's something that another tradition has refined, developed in its own context that we, as kind of heirs to Christian scriptures and Jewish scriptures, could have had as part of our own tradition, but we just didn't. So the casting of lots would be a great example of that. So these connections might be illuminating, right? It's like, I didn't notice that about my own tradition, but now I do. It might reveal something. It might be challenging, though. Like, I can sometimes come down and think, like, that is not what I think. It's okay if other people do it, but I think of this sometimes as if you ever gotten dressed in the morning and you're not sure whether a particular sweater is navy or black, and so you have to hold it up to something black so you can see whether it's navy or black. It becomes clear. This is how I tend to think of interacting with other traditions is I see something clearly, something turns out to be navy, but I only knew that it was navy because I held it up next to something that was black, right? So sometimes, a tradition that challenges me helps me to clarify my own point of view. And we're also, in this middle way, though, going to try to avoid generalizations. And I'll talk about how we do that. So I want to give some examples of this middle way, because I'm not trying to say that I, all on my own, have forged this middle way while everyone else is stuck between the old and the new, right? I'm very grateful in my life to have had models of this middle way. They're mostly Catholic. Okay, Roman Catholics are great at this, right? And so Francis Clooney is a priest from the Society of Jesus that is a Jesuit, and he's been on this for a long time, this practice of what he calls interreligious reading. So I got to hear him speak maybe 12 years ago, and was really inspired. So in this form, the big assumption behind his work is that studying multiple religions intensifies our devotion. He works with Christian texts and Hindu texts. And that to me was we might assume, like, well, if I teach someone about Buddhism or whatever, they're going to say, like, oh, that's cool, and kind of lose touch with, say, well, their account of suffering is better than my Christian account of suffering. So I'll, kind of loosen my hold on my own tradition. He says in his experience, and I'll say in my own, that's simply not true, right? I'm a more engaged and invested Episcopalian than I am for having explored other traditions. There's another writer, I forget, I'm blanking on her name, but I think she wrote this book called Writing Down the Bones, but she was Jewish, and she decided to explore Buddhism, and she complained to her teacher that the more Buddhist meditation she practiced, the more Jewish she became. And her teacher said, yes, like that, then it's working. You're like becoming more of yourself. So I would say, that's true, my own experience as well. Sometimes comparisons actually clarify differences, as I said before, and illuminate aspects of our own tradition. Another great Catholic example, this book actually just came out. I haven't had a chance to read it, but it's about looking at Confucianism alongside Catholicism. And you don't need to know all this, but they emphasize that both traditions have a theme of moral cultivation. A lot of people think of Roman Catholicism as, big on original sin because of Augustine. And one of the contributors to this volume says, well, there were other early Christian attitudes toward childhood moral development, that children do have kind of good instincts, right? And over the course of Christian life, you nourish those. You don't just have totally bad instincts and then you try to wipe them out and replace them with good. There was actually a similar debate within early Confucianism. Are people inherently evil? Are they inherently bad? And the team that went out had this teaching on the 4 sprouts, which is we each have different sprouts in us toward fairness or kindness, and our job in life is to nourish those sprouts so that they bear fruit. They also had an interesting way of dealing with ancestor veneration. So ancestor veneration is common within Confucianism, and Roman Catholic missionaries, and I'm sure Protestant missionaries as well, are kind of uncomfortable with this. Like, it looks like idolatry, like you're worshiping your dead grandma, like you have a statue of her and you give her devotion and stuff. So what to do with ancestor veneration was a big challenge for missionaries. So one of the contributors to this book talks about kind of incorporating ancestor veneration into a practice from Jesuits of imagining, using the imagination in prayer, really. So often this takes the form of imagining a scene from Scripture to make it come to life, and then maybe you imagine a conversation with Jesus. And they say, well, you could do this with your ancestors as well, right? Imagine them alive, and what dialogue would you have with them or something. So these are just examples that I have valued from Roman Catholics and especially Jesuits in kind of forging a middle way here between overemphasis on sameness and strong emphasis on difference. Another model for me is feminist interreligious dialogue. I haven't read that. This is going to be a theme. I know about a book, but I haven't actually read it, right? So in this case, though, I saw these two authors speak to each other. So then I bought the book after I'd seen them kind of do the live version of this dialogue. Their names are Carol Christ. Her last name is spelled like Christ, but she goes by Christ. She actually passed away in the past year. And she was famous for leading goddess pilgrimages to the island of Crete in Greece. And Judith Plasko is a Jewish feminist. All right, so they had a dialogue about, the book is called Goddess and God in the World, Conversations in Embodied Theology. And for me, what I took away from that dialogue, one thing, is that differences aren't a bad thing. In fact, they had this, it was kind of funny, it's the kind of thing I would have found tense, right? But now I don't anymore. They were talking about whether God could do evil. And Judith Plasko was saying along the lines of, I don't want to overdo it, but basically it was the controversy is God only good, or are God's actions somewhat beyond easy moral categorization, right, as good and evil? And Judith Plasko said something like, well, my way explains such and such better. And she said, that's why I think my way is better. And I would think, if I were up on a panel with a Buddhist and an imam, a different thing, I would never say something like that, right? I would never say, like, my way is better. But they had the kind of credibility to say something like that, right? And they had a long friendship from their divinity school days, and so it wasn't that bad to say, like, well, I think I'm right and you're wrong, right? I would be very cautious about, especially in a public setting, right, when I said that. But it made me feel like sometimes you come to your conclusion and that's your conclusion, and you feel like your way of looking at Christ or God is better than other ways, right? And that's not necessarily bad, right? They also showed that lived experience was as valuable as abstract knowledge, right? So having lived as a goddess feminist or a Jewish feminist, they were able to incorporate more of their life and their physical existence into their conclusions about God. So that, to me, is also kind of part of this middle way approach. All right, so those are some of my pioneers. And also, it came out in that conversation because they were Jewish and feminist, goddess feminist. And in the audience, which included Christians like myself, some people commented on how nice it was to see a religious dialogue that did not include or center Christianity, that other people do theology too, right? And so there's not a Christian perspective included in this book. There's tons of Christian perspectives on these issues in other books, right? But it made me think about, how to relinquish some privilege that comes with Christianity in the realm of theology. Right. Okay. So those are some of my pioneers. I'm going to say a few things here about how I'll try to avoid generalizations in what we do together. It'll be hard. In practice, I'm going to do my best to avoid saying sentences that begin with the name of a religious tradition. So I'm not going to say Islam is a religion of peace or Islam is a religion of violence, right? I'm not going to say Confucianism teaches that blah, blah, blah. I'll try to be really clear about what specific person, Muslim or time period I'm talking about. And I'll also similarly avoid saying Buddhists believe XYZ or Jews do this every Friday night, right? Because we have varying levels of observance in different communities and opinion as well. So that's kind of my practical thing. You can, if I lapse into one of these overgeneralizations, you can just interrupt me. In principle, though, I want to just let you in on some of the guiding claims behind the way I'll be approaching this. So in principle, I want us to recognize that religious traditions are internally diverse, and I'll talk a little bit more about each of these, that they change over time, and that they're embedded in culture. So I'll go through all three of these. I just want us to want you to know where I'm coming from. So as far as religions are internally diverse, a lot of us know this. Here, this is just a famous example of early Buddhist traditions that continue on today that emphasize your own efforts in becoming enlightened. Right? No one can reach nirvana for you. You can be taught, but you have to do it yourself. And then later, and what became the more numerous form of Buddhism, teaches that you can be helped by other beings who are called bodhisattvas, who could be enlightened, but instead they decide not to be enlightened so that they can stay in this realm and help other people. So I hope this comes up later. I just want you to, this is just a classic example of internal diversity. So I can't come in and tell you Buddhists say that bodhisattvas can help you reach enlightenment, right? Because, probably a Buddhist in Thailand in particular would say, no, that's ridiculous. I don't think that. All right, so they're all internally diverse. I think Judaism to me is the version of internal diversity that I'm most familiar with, probably. I don't know if anyone has seen this movie, The Chosen. It's like a classic 80s movie about Jews around World War II. And a friendship between a Hasidic young man and the son of a secular Zionist, right? This is prior to the formation of the state of Israel. And they have very different opinions on whether there should be a state of Israel. So it's a wonderful movie, but all the characters are Jewish, right? And yet they have strong disagreements about all kinds of things. So because of this internal diversity, which I always try to show to some degree, I'm inclined to define religious traditions not as bound together by common belief or common practice, but bound together by what they agree is important to fight about. Right? So that may be overstated, but it's like Christians, especially early Christians. They did not agree, right? Even today they don't, but especially in the early days, they did not agree on whether Jesus was fully human, fully divine, had two natures or one nature, all that kind of stuff. But they agreed that it's important to fight about that, right? Or to have an opinion about that. So I kind of approach religious diversity, internal diversity in that way. All religious traditions change over time. This is an example from my personal life. I don't know if anyone saw the movie Friendly Persuasion from the night. It's like a 50s movie. I was fascinated with it. It's about Quakers. And there's a scene when a young Quaker woman, they all dress modestly like you see pictured here. She's on a swing. And because she's on a swing, her dress is sort of, it's an ankle-length dress, but it's like riding up a little bit. And so you could see her ankles, and it was like, oh my goodness, the ankles. I mean, it was just so titillating to the people in this community. Well, I went to it wasn't Episcopalian, a Christian summer camp where we were also encouraged to dress modestly. And for us, modest dress, they took all the girls aside and they said, this is summertime, that what you should do is put on your shorts and then you should bend over in front of a female friend who could tell you whether your shorts were long enough or not based on that. And so to me, this gulf is huge, right? For Christians they're generally like, you should dress modestly, right? That's the continuing principle. But modest for a Quaker in, I don't know when this is supposed to be set, 18th, 19th century, that meant like you do not show any skin, right? Except your face and your hands, right? But for a girl in the 80s and 90s, that meant just make sure your shorts are halfway to your knee, right? So we're going to see this in religion, like this is a trivial example, but it just changes so much over time, And then my last principle is to remember that religions are embedded in culture. So the example I have here actually comes from a friend's experience. They were missionaries in Guatemala, and they moved back to the United States, I think to Colorado, and someone they knew in Guatemala came to visit them. And it was 4th of July, so they went to church. And this is not an actual picture of that church, but it was probably something like this, right? The American flags everywhere, and the vibe of the service, thank God for our country, for our chosen nation, like all this. And the Guatemalan Christians were like, what is happening here? This is not this isn't happening in Guatemalan church, you know what I mean? And so, so many of us, that's a pretty visible example, right? We can't really tell the difference, right, between what we do because we're Christians and what we do because we're Americans or Arkansans or whatever it is. A lot of our values are just a fusion. So it's not easy to just go in and say, well, that's the religion part, and that's what we're going to study. You're always studying religion as part of a subculture that has lots of different elements that you can't really detangle. So this also is not an image from what I'm going to tell you about, but is the closest I could find. So when I lived in Nepal, there was a church in a village that had an image in their chapel of Jesus seated in meditation, right? And I'd never seen an image of Jesus like that, right? And also, there's so many examples of Jesus praying in the gospel, and sweating in his prayer, Was he sitting cross-legged? We don't know, right? But their representation of Christ was really connected to what a holy person looks like in their own culture, right? So I'm never going to be able to teach you about kind of pure Islam or pure Buddhism. It's always mixed with culture. So a lot of us know that from intuitively, if you've grown up Christian, lived in a Christian culture, you'll know that, but I would just want to share an example from my own family. This is my maternal grandfather, and I picked this, it's a good picture of him, but he has like a military cut. So he told me once about his own father, who had grown up in the United States as a German heritage Mennonite, and during World War I, he was a conscientious objector, and went to a conscientious objector camp and met a friend whose sister he later married, all right? So this is kind of how they met. And then when World War II broke out, my grandpa was 17. So he needed his father's permission to enlist, being under 18. And his father did. He signed it, and he said, my dad said that was the hardest thing he ever had to do, because he had strong convictions that to be a Christian was not to do military service. But for my son, being a Christian meant putting his own life on the line, And he told me that story in the airport right before I went to Nepal, because for my parents, they didn't put it this way, but being a Christian meant, being grateful for the things that you have, and you can practice your Christianity here in the United States. And for me, being a Christian meant going, taking risks and serving, throwing myself into service and all that kind of thing, right? So a lot of us know intuitively from our own family backgrounds or cultural backgrounds or experience that Christianity is internally diverse, that it changes over time, and that it's embedded in our cultures. So we can analogize that to all other religious traditions that they share and try not to look at them as homogenized in a way that we know, and unchanging, right, in a way that we know Christianity is not. Right? So I'll move real quickly to how I know what I know, okay? This is an image that's almost exactly 20 years old. I'm in the blue shirt at a Buddhist stupa in Kathmandu. So it's hard to see, but there I am. A lot of what I know about religious traditions is experiential. When I was 18, I got to accompany my dad on a business trip to Malaysia and Singapore and Hong Kong. And Malaysia is a Muslim country, and my dad's coworker had a teenage nephew who kind of took me around, and we went to see the movie Con Air. It has Nicolas Cage. I had seen it in the United States. He saw it, and he took me to see it, but it was censored because of rules in the country about what you could see in terms of violence and inappropriate things. So I told him all the scenes that he was missing, right? So I have lots of stories. I love to travel, so I have lots of stories like that. So it's experiential. But I also have a PhD in religious studies, so got to take lots of classes in graduate school on theories of religion, methods in religious studies. I got to TA for the Buddhism professor and the Hinduism professor, and in a comparative goddesses class and that kind of thing too. So I'll stop there. Do we normally go to 10:45 or 10:50? 45. Okay, 45 with a little over, So I'll stop there and then look forward to doing Hinduism with you all next Sunday. But I'll stick around for a few minutes in case anyone has any questions or responses. So thanks everyone for being here.